Hi, my name's Kaelen, and at my father-in-law's burial, his entire family called me a worthless leech right in front of everyone. They said I was nothing but a burden who married their daughter for money. And you know what hurt most? Corinna stood there in her black dress, nodding along like they were speaking gospel truth. They demanded I leave the cemetery before I embarrassed the family any further. So I walked away quietly, but not before I left one small envelope with the lawyer. Just one piece of paper that would change everything they thought they knew about me. Want to know what was inside that envelope? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had imagined this day would bring the family together. After all the years of tension, all the whispered conversations that stopped when I walked into rooms, I thought Harold's passing might finally soften their hearts. Instead, standing in the parking lot of Willowbrook Cemetery on that gray October morning, I knew I was walking into a battlefield disguised as a funeral. The air was thick with autumn mist and the kind of cold that seeps through your bones. Black sedans lined the narrow cemetery road like a funeral procession for hope itself. I straightened my tie for the third time, checked my watch, and took a deep breath that tasted of dying leaves and regret. Corinna stepped out of our car, her black dress elegant as always, but her movements were stiff, mechanical. She'd barely spoken to me during the 20-minute drive from our home in Thornfield Heights. When I tried to take her hand as we walked toward the gathering crowd, she'd pulled away with a look that said everything I needed to know about where I stood in this family drama. "Remember?" she'd whispered as we approached the group. "Today is about Dad. Just try to blend in." Blend in. As if I hadn't been trying to do exactly that for the past 8 years of marriage. The Draven family stood clustered near the gravesite like a pack of well-dressed wolves. Harold's brother Edmund, a man who'd made millions in commercial development and never let anyone forget it, held court near the head of the casket. His wife, Vivienne, draped in designer mourning attire that probably cost more than most people's rent, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief that had clearly never seen actual tears. Then there was Corinna's older brother Theron, whose law practice had made him the family's unofficial spokesman and chief enforcer of social order. He stood, with his arms crossed, surveying the gathering like a general preparing for battle. His wife, Leanna, whispered something in his ear, and both their gazes shifted to me with unmistakable hostility. But it was Harold's sister Octavia who worried me most. She'd never liked me from day one, and Harold's death had apparently freed her from any pretense of civility. She stood apart from the others, her silver hair pulled back severely, her pale eyes scanning the crowd with the intensity of someone looking for weakness to exploit. I'd spent hours the night before going through old photo albums, remembering better times. Harold teaching me to fish at Clearwater Lake during our second year of marriage. The way he'd laughed when I'd caught my first bass, bigger than his own. How he'd clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Welcome to the family, son," with genuine warmth in his voice. That was before the diagnosis. Before the medical bills started piling up. Before the family dynamics shifted and I became the outsider again. The funeral director, a soft-spoken man named Morrison, began organizing people for the graveside service. I found myself pushed to the back of the group, standing behind distant cousins and family friends who barely knew Harold but somehow ranked higher in the social order than the man who'd spent every weekend for 3 years driving him to treatments in the city. Pastor Williams from Gracefield Methodist stepped forward to begin the service. His voice carried across the cemetery grounds, speaking about Harold's life, his dedication to family, his successful career in municipal planning. All true things, but somehow incomplete. There was no mention of the quiet man who'd spent Sunday mornings teaching neighborhood kids to fix their bicycles. No reference to the countless hours he'd volunteered at the Millbrook Community Center. No acknowledgement of the small acts of kindness that had defined him more than any professional achievement. As William spoke about Harold's legacy, I found my mind drifting to the manila envelope tucked inside my jacket pocket. 3 days earlier, while helping Corinna sort through Harold's papers, I'd found it in his desk drawer, my name written across the front in his familiar handwriting. Inside had been documents I never expected to see, along with a letter that had turned my understanding of the past decade completely upside down. I hadn't told Corinna about it yet, hadn't told anyone. But standing there listening to the sanitized version of Harold's life, I wondered if I'd been protecting the wrong people all these years. The service continued with readings and hymns, but I barely heard them. Instead, I watched the family dynamics play out in subtle gestures and meaningful glances. Edmund checking his watch. Vivian whispering to her daughters about something obviously unrelated to the ceremony. Theron's wife Liana taking photos with her phone, as if Harold's burial was content for her social media feed. Only Corinna seemed genuinely affected by her father's passing, and even her grief was carefully contained, performed rather than felt. When she did cry, it was with the practiced restraint of someone who'd learned early that emotional displays were signs of weakness in this family. Near the end of the service, Pastor Williams invited family members to share memories. Edmund stepped forward first, delivering a polished speech about Harold's business acumen and community standing. Octavia followed with remarks about family traditions and maintaining dignity in difficult times. Each speaker seemed to be performing for an audience rather than honoring a man they'd loved. When Williams asked if anyone else wanted to speak, I felt a moment's impulse to step forward. I could have told them about Harold's real character, about the man who'd welcomed me into his family before the money became an issue, about the afternoons we'd spent talking about everything from baseball to philosophy while sitting on his back porch, about how he'd worried constantly about leaving his family financially secure. But the hostile glances from around the circle made it clear that my contribution wouldn't be welcome. So I stayed silent, just another mourner in the crowd, invisible despite being the one person who'd probably spent the most time with Harold during his final months. As the service concluded and people began to disperse toward their cars, I overheard fragments of conversation that made my stomach turn. Discussions about the estate, about property values, about who would inherit what. Harold wasn't even in the ground yet, and they were already dividing up his legacy like vultures picking over carrion. Corinna walked beside me toward the parking area, but the distance between us felt oceanic. When I tried to put my arm around her shoulders, she shrugged away with an annoyed sigh. "Can you just give me some space right now?" she muttered, not meeting my eyes. Behind us, I could hear Edmund's voice carrying across the parking lot, already making plans for the family gathering at Octavia's house, something about discussing practical matters and moving forward. The conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed I was within earshot. That's when I knew this day was far from over. The burial had been just the opening act. The real drama was waiting for us at the family house, where the gloves would finally come off and 8 years of barely concealed resentment would explode into the open. I climbed into our car and waited for Corinna to join me, the manila envelope feeling like a loaded gun in my jacket pocket. In a few hours, I'd have to decide whether to use the ammunition Harold had left me, or continue playing the role of the quiet, accommodating son-in-law who knew his place. The gray sky above Willowbrook Cemetery seemed to mirror my mood as we pulled away from Harold's final resting place. But storm clouds were gathering for more than just the weather. The Draven family home stood like a fortress at the end of Elmwood Drive, all brick and ivy and old money intimidation. I'd been here dozens of times over the years, but today it felt different, more hostile. The circular driveway was already crowded with luxury vehicles when Corinna and I arrived, their polished surfaces reflecting the gray afternoon sky like mirrors of judgment. Inside, the house hummed with controlled chaos. Octavia had transformed the main living room into a reception area, complete with catered food and an open bar that several family members were already taking advantage of. The walls were lined with photographs spanning decades of Draven family history, a visual testament to their success and social standing. Notably absent from most of these pictures was me. I helped myself to coffee from the sideboard and tried to find a corner where I could observe without drawing attention. The conversations flowing around me were a mixture of genuine grief and barely concealed excitement about the inheritance implications. Harold had been wealthy, owning multiple properties around Millbrook County, and everyone seemed to have opinions about how his estate should be distributed. Edmund held court near the fireplace, his voice booming as he discussed property values and market conditions with several cousins. Vivian had gathered the women near the bay windows, ostensibly sharing memories but actually gossiping about family members who hadn't made it to the funeral. The younger generation clustered around the bar, checking their phones and making plans for later. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Corinna moved through the groups like she was campaigning for office, accepting condolences and playing the role of the devoted daughter. When people asked about me, she deflected with practiced ease, changing the subject to her father's legacy or the beauty of the service. I might as well have been invisible. The tension in the room was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. Everyone was waiting for something, though I wasn't sure what. Then Edmund called for attention, tapping a spoon against his whiskey glass until the conversations died down. "Family," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Before we get too deep into reminiscing, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Harold's estate." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people shifted uncomfortably while others leaned forward with obvious interest. I noticed Theron pulling out his phone, probably preparing to take notes. "Now I know this might seem premature," Edmund continued, "but Harold would have wanted us to handle things efficiently. His will is pretty straightforward, mostly leaving everything to Corinna as his only heir, but there are some complications we need to discuss." He paused dramatically, letting his gaze sweep the room before landing squarely on me. "Specifically, we need to talk about protecting the family assets from any potential claims or complications." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I felt every pair of eyes in the room turning toward me, and the coffee in my cup suddenly tasted like ash. Octavia stepped forward, her silver hair catching the light from the crystal chandelier. "Since we're being frank, I think we should address what everyone's thinking. Harold's illness was expensive. Very expensive. And some of us are concerned about where the money for those treatments came from." My heart started racing, but I kept my expression neutral. Around the room, family members were nodding and murmuring agreement. They'd clearly been discussing this behind closed doors. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Corinna asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Theron cleared his throat and stepped into his role as family lawyer. "We're suggesting that there may have been some financial irregularities in Dad's final years. Expensive treatments, private nurses, experimental procedures that insurance didn't cover. Someone was paying for all of that." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. I could feel my face burning with embarrassment and anger, but I forced myself to remain silent. These people had no idea what they were talking about, but explaining the truth would require revealing things I wasn't ready to share. Edmund picked up the thread. "Look, we all know Kaelen's a decent enough guy, but let's be realistic about his situation. He works at a community college, lives in a modest house, drives a 10-year-old Honda. Where would he get the kind of money Harold's care required?" "Maybe he didn't," Octavia said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Maybe Harold was dipping into assets that should have been preserved for the family. Maybe someone was influencing him to be more generous than he should have been." The room erupted in whispered conversations as family members processed this theory. I watched in amazement as they constructed an entire narrative of financial manipulation without a single piece of evidence. It was like watching a masterclass in group delusion. Vivienne stepped forward, dabbing at her eyes with that same lace handkerchief. Harold was so vulnerable in those final months. He wasn't thinking clearly. The medications, the stress, the depression, it would have been so easy for someone to take advantage. "Are you accusing me of elder abuse?" I finally spoke, my voice carrying across the room like a whip crack. The conversation stopped instantly. Edmund raised his hands in a gesture of false conciliation. "No one's accusing you of anything illegal, Kaelen. We're just concerned about the family's financial security. Harold worked his whole life to build this estate, and we want to make sure it goes where he intended." "Which is to his daughter," I said, looking directly at Corinna. "Not to his extended family." Theron stepped forward, his lawyer instincts taking over. "Actually, that's not entirely accurate. Harold owned multiple properties that have been in the family for generations. There are considerations beyond just the will." "What kinds of considerations?" Corinna asked, and I could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. Octavia smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen. "The kinds that protect family assets from outsiders who might have undue influence." The word outsiders hit me like a physical blow. After 8 years of marriage, after being Harold's primary caregiver, after countless family dinners and holidays and shared memories, I was still an outsider. "Let me be more direct," Edmund said, setting down his glass and fixing me with a stare. "We think it would be in everyone's best interest if you voluntarily waived any claim to Harold's estate. A simple legal document stating that you have no financial interest in family properties or assets." The room held its collective breath. I could feel Corinna's eyes on me, but when I looked at her, she glanced away. That small gesture told me everything I needed to know about where she stood. "And if I refuse?" I asked. Edmund's expression hardened. "Then we'll have to explore other options. Contested wills, investigations into financial irregularities, challenges to the validity of any documents that might benefit you. It could get ugly." "Dad," Corinna said quietly, but she was talking to Edmund, not defending her husband. "Maybe we should discuss this privately." But Octavia wasn't interested in privacy. She stepped closer to me, her pale eyes glittering with malice. "You know what I think, Kaelen? I think you saw a sick old man with money and decided to cash in. I think you've been planning this for years, working your way into the family, gaining Harold's trust, waiting for your payday." The accusation was so outrageous, so completely divorced from reality, that I actually laughed, which only made things worse. "You think this is funny?" Octavia continued, her voice rising. "You think it's amusing that you married into this family under false pretenses?" "What false pretenses?" I demanded. "The pretense that you actually cared about anything other than money," she shot back. "The pretense that you belonged here. The pretense that you were anything more than a gold digger who got lucky." The room exploded in voices as family members took sides or tried to calm the situation, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears and the sound of 8 years of suppressed resentment finally breaking free. I looked around the room at these people I'd tried so hard to please, these people whose approval I'd chased like a dog begging for scraps. They were staring at me with expressions ranging from hostility to disgust to pity, and in that moment I realized I was done trying to convince them of my worth. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the manila envelope Harold had left for me. The one I'd been carrying like a secret weapon, waiting for the right moment to deploy it. As I held it up, the room gradually fell silent again. "Harold left me something," I said quietly. "Something I think you all need to see." But before I could open the envelope, Theron stepped forward with his hand raised. "Whatever that is, I'd advise you not to produce it without legal counsel present. Any documents related to the estate need to be properly authenticated and reviewed." I smiled, and for the first time all day it was genuine. "Oh, I think you're going to want to see this right now." The envelope crackled as I tore it open, and inside was a single sheet of paper that would change everything they thought they knew about Harold's estate, about his final wishes, and about exactly who they'd been calling an outsider all these years. The paper in my hands felt heavier than it should have, weighted with implications that would shatter everything the Draven family thought they understood about their patriarch's legacy. But as I prepared to reveal Harold's final surprise, Corinna stepped forward with a look I'd never seen before, cold and calculating. "Kaelen, don't," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Whatever that is, this isn't the time or place." I stared at my wife, searching her face for some sign of support, some indication that she might stand with her husband against her family's accusations. Instead, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Recognition. She knew what was in that envelope. Somehow, she already knew. "You've seen this before," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Her eyes flickered away for just a moment, but it was enough. The room seemed to tilt around me as the pieces clicked into place. All those evenings when Corinna had insisted on handling Harold's paperwork alone. All those private conversations with her father that stopped when I entered the room. All those times she'd deflected my questions about his estate planning. "I was protecting you," she said quietly, but her words carried no conviction. Edmund stepped closer, sensing vulnerability. Protecting him from what, exactly? Corinna's composure cracked slightly, from making things worse for himself, from saying or doing something he'd regret. The betrayal was so complete, so unexpected, that I actually felt dizzy. My own wife had been working against me, conspiring with her family to keep me in the dark about Harold's true intentions. Every conversation we'd had about his final wishes, every discussion about inheritance and family obligations, had been theater designed to manipulate me. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Kaelen, please," she said, reaching for my arm. "Let's discuss this at home, privately." I pulled away from her touch. "How long, Corinna?" She glanced around the room, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation. "Dad told me about his plans 6 months ago. He asked me to keep it confidential until after the reading of the will." 6 months. For half a year, while I'd been caring for her father, driving him to appointments, sitting with him during treatments. She'd known something that directly affected our future, and had chosen to keep me ignorant. The level of deception was breathtaking. Octavia seized the moment like a predator sensing wounded prey. "What exactly did Harold tell you, dear?" Corinna looked trapped, caught between loyalty to her deceased father and the growing pressure from her family. He was concerned about protecting the estate from potential complications. He wanted to ensure that family property stayed in the family. "Complications like me," I said flatly. "Complications like any outside claims." She corrected, but her tone was defensive. Theron stepped forward, his legal instincts taking over. "If Harold expressed concerns about estate planning, then we have an obligation to honor his wishes. That document," he pointed to the envelope in my hands, "could be an outdated version of his intentions." But I was no longer listening to Theron's legal maneuvering. I was focused entirely on my wife, on the woman I'd loved and trusted and apparently never really known. "You let me plan his funeral. You let me speak to the doctors. You let me make decisions about his care. All while knowing that he'd written me out of his plans." "That's not exactly what happened," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then tell me exactly what did happen." The room fell silent except for the continued ticking of that grandfather clock. Corinna looked around at her family members, clearly seeking support or guidance. What she found instead were expectant faces waiting for her to choose a side. "Dad was worried about you," she finally said. "He thought you were too involved in his financial affairs." "Too involved in keeping him alive, you mean?" "Too involved in making decisions that weren't yours to make," Edmund interjected. "Harold mentioned that you'd been asking questions about his properties, about his investments. He found it concerning." This was news to me. I'd never asked Harold about his investments beyond casual conversations about market conditions and retirement planning. But I was beginning to understand that the truth was less important than the narrative the family had constructed. "What kinds of questions?" I asked. Vivienne spoke up from her position near the windows. Questions about property values, about rental income, about which assets were liquid, the kinds of questions someone asks when they're planning for their own financial future. The accusation was so twisted, so far from the reality of my conversations with Harold, that I felt like I was living in an alternate universe. I asked about his properties because I was concerned about his ability to maintain them. I asked about income because I was worried about his medical expenses. I asked about liquidity because I thought he might need to sell something to cover his care costs. "Or because you were planning your own financial security," Octavia added with venom. I looked around the room at these people who'd known me for nearly a decade, who'd shared holidays and family milestones, who'd supposedly welcomed me into their fold. The hostility in their faces was so complete that I wondered if they'd ever seen me as anything other than a threat to their inheritance. "You really believe that?" I asked. "You really think I married Corinna? Spent 8 years building a life with her? Took care of her father during his final illness? All as some elaborate financial scheme?" "Stranger things have happened," Edmund said with a shrug. "People are capable of remarkable patience when enough money is involved." The casual cruelty of his response was staggering. These people had reduced 8 years of my life, 8 years of genuine love and commitment and sacrifice, to a simple financial transaction. In their minds, I was nothing more than a con artist who'd played a very long game. But it was Corinna's silence that hurt most. She stood there watching her family destroy her husband's character and said nothing in his defense. Worse, her body language suggested she agreed with their assessment. "Say something," I said to her. "Tell them they're wrong. Tell them you know me better than that." She looked at me with something that might have been pity. "I know you're not a bad person, Kaelen, but I also know that Dad's money changed things between us. You can't deny that our relationship got more complicated after he got sick." "More complicated how?" "More focused on his care, his needs, his problems, less focused on us." The accusation was so unfair that I felt my temper finally beginning to fray. Your father was dying. Of course I focused on his care. Of course his needs became a priority. I thought that's what family did for each other. "But you're not family," Octavia said quietly, and her words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. "That's the point. You're not blood. You don't have the same investment in preserving what Harold built." "I have the same investment in honoring what he wanted," I replied. "Which is exactly what we're trying to do," Edmund said. "Honor his final wishes by keeping his estate intact and in the family." I realized then that we were speaking different languages. To them, family meant bloodline and inheritance rights. To me, it had meant something entirely different. Love, commitment, shared responsibility, mutual support. We'd been having different conversations for 8 years, and I'd been too naive to notice. The envelope in my hands crackled as I tightened my grip. Inside was Harold's real final wish, the document that would reveal just how wrong they all were about his intentions. But looking around the room at their hostile faces, at my wife's defensive posture, at the years of barely concealed resentment finally breaking free, I realized that the truth might not matter. They'd already decided who I was and what I deserved. The evidence of Harold's real feelings might shock them temporarily, but it wouldn't change their fundamental belief that I was an outsider who'd manipulated their way into a family fortune. For the first time since entering this house, I smiled, not because I was happy, but because I finally understood the game I'd been playing. And more importantly, I understood that I held cards they didn't even know existed. "You know what?" I said, sliding the envelope back into my jacket pocket. "You're absolutely right. I'm not blood family. I don't have the same investment in preserving Harold's legacy." The room relaxed slightly, interpreting my words as surrender. "But that doesn't mean I don't have any investments to protect," I continued, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Edmund's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" I looked directly at Corinna, memorizing her face as it was in that moment, before everything changed forever. "It means your father left me more than just a letter, sweetheart. It means this conversation is far from over." The drive home from the Draven house felt like traveling through a different world, one where the familiar streets of Thornfield Heights had been replaced by alien landscape. Corinna sat in the passenger seat, her silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. The manila envelope rested in my jacket pocket like a loaded weapon I wasn't quite ready to fire. Our house stood at the end of Maple Court, a modest 2-story colonial that we'd bought 5 years earlier, with what Corinna had assumed was money from my college savings and a small inheritance from my grandmother. She'd never asked too many questions about our finances, content to let me handle the mortgage payments, utilities, and daily expenses, while she focused on her career as a museum curator. What she didn't know was that the house was just one small piece of a much larger financial picture that I'd kept carefully hidden for nearly a decade. I parked in our driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the front door that suddenly felt like the entrance to someone else's life. Everything looked the same on the surface, but the foundation of trust that had held our marriage together had cracked beyond repair in the span of a single afternoon. "Are you coming in?" Corinna asked, her hand already on the door handle. "In a minute," I said, pulling out my phone. "I need to make a call." She hesitated, clearly wanting to ask who I was calling, but something in my expression must have warned her off. After 8 years of marriage, she knew when to give me space. What she didn't know was that this might be the last time she'd have that privilege. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Gerald Blackwood, the only person outside of Harold who knew the truth about my financial situation. Gerald had been my grandfather's lawyer, and later mine, handling the complex web of trusts and corporations that managed what most people would consider a substantial fortune. "Gerald, it's Kaelen," I said when he answered. "I was wondering when you'd call," he replied, his voice carrying the gravitas that came from 40 years of handling wealthy clients' secrets. "I heard about Harold's passing. My condolences." "Thank you. I need to see you tomorrow morning. It's time to activate the contingency plans we discussed." There was a pause. "Are you certain, once we move forward, there's no going back to the way things were?" I looked through the windshield of my house, where Corinna was probably already on the phone with her family, strategizing about how to minimize the damage from my mysterious threats. "I'm certain." "Very well. My office at 9 a.m. and Kaelen, bring the envelope Harold left you. I suspect we'll need it." After hanging up, I sat in the car for another 10 minutes, organizing my thoughts and preparing for the conversation I was about to have with my wife. When I finally walked through our front door, I found Corinna in the kitchen, making tea with the methodical precision she used when she was trying to process difficult emotions. "I called Theron," she said without turning around. "He thinks you're bluffing about having additional documents. He says Harold's will was very specific about his intentions." I hung my jacket on the back of a chair, careful not to disturb the envelope in the pocket. "What exactly did Harold tell you 6 months ago?" She poured hot water into 2 mugs, her movements careful and controlled. He said he was concerned about your relationship with money. He thought you were becoming too comfortable with the idea of inheriting his wealth. And you agreed with him? She finally turned to face me, and I could see the strain of the afternoon in the lines around her eyes. I thought he might have a point. You'd become very involved in his financial affairs, very interested in his properties and investments. It seemed like more than casual concern. I accepted the mug of tea she offered, wrapping my hands around its warmth. Did it ever occur to you that I was interested because I was the one paying for most of his medical care? The mug paused halfway to her lips. What do you mean? I mean that the experimental treatments, the private nurses, the specialized equipment, the round-the-clock care during his final months, that wasn't covered by insurance, Corinna. Someone had to pay for it. Dad had savings, investments, the income from his properties. Your father's savings were exhausted within the first year of his diagnosis. The income from his properties barely covered the taxes and maintenance. The investment portfolio he'd built over 30 years was liquidated to pay for his initial treatments. I could see the confusion and dawning realization in her face. That's not possible. He never said anything about money problems. Because I made sure he didn't have to. Every bill, every treatment, every accommodation that kept him comfortable during his illness, I covered it. The family thinks I was asking questions about his finances because I was greedy. The truth is, I was asking because I was trying to figure out how to preserve what little he had left for you. Corinna set down her mug with shaking hands. How much? Over the past 3 years? Close to $2 million. The number hung between us like a confession. I watched my wife's face cycle through disbelief, confusion, and finally a kind of horror as she processed the implications. Where did you get $2 million? She whispered. I walked to the window that overlooked our backyard, where Harold had taught me to prune the apple trees he'd planted years before. That's a complicated story. I think I deserve the uncomplicated version right now. I turned back to face her, this woman I'd loved and protected and apparently failed to truly know. My grandfather didn't die poor, Corinna. He died very wealthy. And he left everything to me. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic on the main road. Corinna stared at me like I'd suddenly revealed myself to be a stranger. Your grandfather was a maintenance worker at a factory, she said slowly. You told me he lived in a trailer park. My grandfather owned the factory. He also owned the trailer park, along with about 40 other properties around the state. He lived modestly because that's how he was raised, but he died worth approximately $50 million. I watched her face as she tried to process this information, tried to reconcile 8 years of assumptions with a reality she'd never imagined. You've been lying to me for our entire marriage. I've been protecting you, and protecting us. I've seen what money does to relationships, to families. I wanted us to build something real first, something that wasn't based on financial expectations or social climbing. Social climbing? Her voice rose with indignation. You think I married you for money? I think you married me because you thought we were equals. Two people from modest backgrounds trying to build better lives together. I was afraid that knowing about my inheritance would change that dynamic. She began pacing around the kitchen, her movements agitated and angry. So you let me worry about mortgage payments? You let me stress about whether we could afford to go on vacation? You watched me agonize over every major purchase while you were secretly wealthy? I was protecting the authenticity of what we had. You were lying, she said flatly. Every day, for 8 years, you were lying to me about who you really are. The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be dangerous. I had been deceiving her, even if my motivations had been pure. I told myself I was preserving the integrity of our relationship, but the result was the same. I'd built our marriage on a foundation of incomplete information. You're right, I said. I should have told you, but I'm telling you now because everything has changed. She stopped pacing and fixed me with a stare that could have cut glass. What do you mean everything has changed? I reached into my jacket and pulled out Harold's envelope. Your father knew about my inheritance. He'd known for years. Her face went white. That's impossible. He never said anything. He never said anything because he asked me not to tell you. He thought the knowledge would complicate your feelings about our marriage, about your place in your family, about what you deserved from life. I opened the envelope and pulled out the letter Harold had written in his careful handwriting. But before he died, he changed his mind. He realized that keeping secrets was destroying the relationships he cared about most. Corinna reached for the letter with trembling hands, but I held it back. Before you read this, you need to understand something else. Your family's accusations this afternoon, their concerns about protecting Harold's estate from my influence, they're not just wrong, they're tragically ironic. What do you mean? I smiled, and for the first time in hours, it wasn't entirely bitter. I mean that Harold's 12 properties, the ones your family is so concerned about preserving, the ones they think I'm trying to steal through manipulation and undue influence? I paused, letting the suspense build. I already own them. I've owned them for 3 years. Your father sold them to me to pay for his medical care, and I've been managing them as his proxy ever since. The look on Corinna's face was worth every moment of humiliation I'd endured at her family's hands. She stared at me like I'd just announced I was actually an alien from another planet, her mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. That's impossible, she finally managed. Those properties have been in the family for generations. I handed her Harold's letter, watching as she unfolded it with hands that shook like autumn leaves. Her eyes moved across the page, reading her father's final explanation for decisions he'd made in secret over the past 3 years. My dearest Corinna, the letter began in Harold's careful script. If you're reading this, then I'm gone and the truth is finally coming to light. I pray you'll understand the choices I made, even if you can't forgive them initially. I watched her face as she absorbed her father's confession, his explanation of how the medical bills had mounted beyond anything insurance would cover, how his savings had evaporated, how the properties that represented 3 generations of family wealth had become his only option for financing his continued care. I want you to know that Kaelen never asked for anything, Harold's letter continued. When I approached him about purchasing the properties, he tried to refuse. He offered to simply give me the money I needed, with no expectation of repayment. It was my insistence that we structure it as a legitimate business transaction. My pride demanded that I not be a charity case, even to the man who'd become like a son to me. Tears were streaming down Corinna's face now, but she kept reading. I also want you to know that Kaelen has been managing these properties at a loss for 3 years, maintaining them exactly as I would have, preserving their character and their connection to our family history. He's been more of a steward than an owner, and he's done it all while allowing me to maintain the fiction that I was still the patriarch with substantial holdings. The letter went on to detail the specific arrangements Harold had made with me, the way we'd structured the purchases to minimize tax implications while maximizing his immediate liquidity for medical expenses. It explained how I'd continued to route rental income back to him, how I'd paid for maintenance and improvements out of my own pocket, how I'd made sure the properties remained exactly as Harold wanted them. But most importantly, the letter concluded, I want you to understand that Kaelen's deception about his own wealth came from the same place as my deception about mine, a desire to protect the people we love from the complications that money brings to relationships. He could have revealed his inheritance years ago and claimed his place as the wealthiest member of our family. Instead, he chose to let you all underestimate him while he quietly took care of everyone's needs. Corinna set the letter down on the kitchen counter and stared at me with eyes that held a mixture of shock, admiration, and something that might have been fear. How much are you worth? Including the properties I bought from your father, approximately $75 million. She sat down heavily in one of our kitchen chairs, the number apparently too large for her to process while standing. $75 million. Give or take a few million depending on market fluctuations. And you work at Willowbrook Community College because? Because I like teaching. Because I believe in education. Because having money doesn't mean I have to stop contributing to society in meaningful ways. She laughed, but it was a sound devoid of humor. My family spent the afternoon calling you a gold digger. Your family spent the afternoon revealing exactly what they think of people they consider beneath their social status. The fact that I'm actually wealthier than all of them combined doesn't change the ugliness of their attitudes. Corinna looked at me with new eyes, as if seeing me for the first time. You could have destroyed them this afternoon. You could have humiliated them the way they humiliated you. I could have. But that would have made me exactly what they accused me of being. Someone who uses money as a weapon. She picked up Harold's letter again, rereading sections with the careful attention of someone trying to understand how her entire worldview had been turned upside down. Dad knew about your inheritance when you and I got married. He figured it out during our engagement. He was a smart man and some things didn't add up about my background. He hired a private investigator to check my story. And he never told me. He asked me if he should, and I asked him not to. I wanted you to love me for who I was, not what I had. But who you are includes being wealthy, she said, her voice gaining strength. That's part of your identity, your capabilities, your options in life. By hiding it, you change the fundamental dynamics of our relationship. She was right, and I knew it. My deception had been well-intentioned but ultimately patronizing. I'd made decisions about what she could handle, what she deserved to know, what was best for our marriage, without giving her the agency to make those choices herself. You're absolutely right, I said, and I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting what we had, but I was actually undermining it. She stood and began pacing again, her curator's mind probably cataloging and analyzing every interaction we'd had through this new lens of understanding. The house, our vacations, the way you never seemed stressed about money, your insistence on paying for everything, all paid for with inherited wealth that I was afraid to tell you about. And my father's care. $2 million over 3 years, yes. She stopped pacing and fixed me with a look that was equal parts grateful and furious. You let my family accuse you of being a gold digger while you were secretly bankrolling my father's medical care. I let your family show their true colors. There's a difference. Is there? Because it seems to me like you set them up, like you knew this moment would come and you were prepared for it. That gave me pause. Had I been setting them up? Had some part of me known that the truth would eventually come out in exactly this way, with maximum dramatic impact and moral authority on my side? Maybe I was, I admitted. Maybe after 8 years of being treated like I didn't quite belong, like I was lucky to be tolerated, some part of me was looking forward to the moment when they'd have to confront their own prejudices. And now what happens? I walked to the window again, looking out at the neighborhood where we'd built our life together, where I'd played the role of a modest community college instructor married to a woman slightly above his station. Now I stopped pretending to be someone I'm not. What does that mean for us? It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. What did this revelation mean for a marriage built on incomplete information? What did it mean for a relationship where one partner had spent 8 years managing the other's expectations and assumptions? I don't know, I said honestly. I know that I love you. I know that everything I've done, including the deception, came from a place of wanting to protect you and protect us. But I also know that trust, once broken, is incredibly difficult to repair. Corinna sat back down, Harold's letter still in her hands. My family is going to be devastated when they learn the truth. Your family is going to be humiliated when they learn the truth. There's a difference. You're really going to tell them? I turned away from the window to face my wife, this woman I'd loved enough to lie to for 8 years. Corinna, this afternoon they didn't just insult me. They revealed who they really are beneath all their social pretensions. They showed me that 8 years of trying to earn their respect was wasted effort, because they were never going to see me as anything other than an outsider who didn't deserve what he had. So you're going to get revenge. I'm going to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own behavior. There's a difference. She was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the revelation about my wealth, but the implications for every relationship in her family. They're going to blame me for not knowing. They're going to say I should have figured it out. Are you more concerned about their reaction or about the fact that your husband has been lying to you for 8 years? The question hung between us like a challenge. In that moment, I realized I was asking her to choose not just between me and her family, but between the comfortable fiction we'd been living and the complicated truth of who we really were. Her answer would determine not just the future of our marriage, but the kind of people we both decided to be going forward. I need time to think, she said finally. How much time? I don't know. This changes everything, Kaelen. Not just about money, but about trust, about honesty, about the foundation our entire relationship is built on. I nodded, understanding that this was probably the best outcome I could hope for in the immediate aftermath of such a revelation. She wasn't walking out immediately, but she also wasn't rushing to embrace this new reality. Take all the time you need, I said, but understand that tomorrow morning I'm going to start being who I really am instead of who I thought you wanted me to be. What does that mean? I smiled, and this time it held genuine anticipation instead of bitter amusement. It means your family is about to discover that the man they spent this afternoon calling a parasite actually owns everything they think they're entitled to inherit. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Gerald Blackwood's law office, casting long shadows across the mahogany conference table where I sat reviewing documents that would fundamentally alter the Draven family's understanding of their own financial situation. Gerald had been working since dawn, assembling the paperwork that would transform me from accused gold digger to revealed benefactor in a matter of hours. "Are you certain you want to proceed this way?" Gerald asked for the third time, his weathered fingers drumming against the leather portfolio that contained 3 years of carefully documented real estate transactions. "Once we reveal your ownership of the properties, there's no returning to the anonymity you've maintained." I looked out the window at the bustling streets of downtown Millbrook, where people hurried to jobs and responsibilities that suddenly seemed impossibly simple compared to the web of deception and family politics I was about to unravel. I'm certain I've spent 8 years trying to earn respect from people who were never going to give it. It's time to stop playing their game. Gerald opened the portfolio and spread the documents across the polished table surface. 12 property deeds, each one bearing my name as the legal owner, each one representing a piece of Draven family history that Harold had been forced to sell to finance his medical care. The irony was almost poetic. The properties they were so desperate to protect from my supposed influence had already been mine for years. "Let's review the timeline one more time," Gerald said, pulling out his reading glasses. 3 years ago, Harold approached you directly about purchasing his properties to raise funds for his medical treatments. Correct. He'd exhausted his liquid savings and didn't want to burden his family with the knowledge of how expensive his care had become. You initially offered to simply loan him the money. Yes, but he insisted on a sale. His pride demanded that it be a legitimate business transaction rather than charity. Gerald nodded, making notes in his careful handwriting. The sales were conducted at fair market value, with independent appraisals for each property. Above market value, actually. I paid him more than the properties were worth, because I knew he needed every dollar for his treatments. And you've been managing the properties as his proxy ever since, routing the rental income back to him and paying for maintenance out of your own pocket. Harold wanted to maintain the illusion that he was still the family patriarch with substantial holdings. I saw no reason to destroy that fiction while he was fighting for his life. Gerald leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "So when the Draven family accuses you of being a financial predator, they're actually describing their own behavior toward a man who spent over $2 million keeping their patriarch alive and comfortable." That's one way to put it. It's the only way to put it, legally speaking. Gerald gathered the documents into neat piles. "Now, how do you want to handle the revelation? We could schedule a formal meeting with the family and their attorney, or we could simply file the ownership documents with the county recorder and let them discover the truth through public records." I considered the options, weighing the satisfaction of a dramatic confrontation against the cleaner resolution of letting the facts speak for themselves. But after yesterday's humiliation, after years of subtle condescension and barely concealed resentment, I found myself craving something more direct. I want to tell them myself, face to face. I want to see their expressions when they realize exactly who they've been calling a parasite. Gerald raised an eyebrow. "That's a bit theatrical, don't you think?" "Gerald, yesterday they accused me of elder abuse in front of a room full of people. They suggested I manipulated a dying man for financial gain. They called me an outsider who didn't deserve to be part of their family." I stood and walked to the window, watching the morning traffic flow through the city center. I think a little theater is appropriate. "And Corinna? How does she fit into this revelation?" The question hit me like a physical blow, reminding me that this wasn't just about settling scores with her family. My wife was caught between loyalty to her relatives and her complicated feelings about discovering that her husband had been deceiving her for their entire marriage. "I don't know," I admitted. "She's processing everything. The money, the lies, the fact that her father kept secrets from her too. I think she's questioning everything she thought she knew about our relationship." That's understandable. Discovering that your spouse has been hiding $75 million would shake anyone's foundation. I turned back to face Gerald, this man who'd helped me manage my inheritance for over a decade, who'd watched me struggle with the isolation that came with inherited wealth. "Do you think I handled it wrong, keeping the money secret?" Gerald removed his glasses and cleaned them thoughtfully. "I think you handled it the way a young man handles complicated emotions and difficult family dynamics. with good intentions and imperfect execution. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. It's an honest assessment. You were trying to protect something precious, but you ended up undermining the trust that made it precious in the first place. The truth of his words settled over me like a weight I'd been carrying without realizing it. Every decision I'd made about concealing my wealth had been motivated by love and fear in equal measure, but the cumulative effect had been to build my marriage on a foundation of incomplete information. "What would you have done?" I asked. "I would have told her after the first year. After you'd established that the relationship was real, but before it became so complicated that the truth would feel like betrayal." Gerald replaced his glasses and looked at me with the kind of paternal concern that came from years of guiding younger people through difficult decisions. "But we can't change the past. We can only decide how to move forward." I returned to my chair and picked up one of the property deeds, running my fingers across Harold's signature transferring ownership of his childhood home to me. "I want to offer them a choice." "What kind of choice?" "The properties. I'll sell them back to the family at the original purchase price. No interest, no profit, no appreciation. They can have their family heritage back, for exactly what Harold needed to pay for his medical care." Gerald leaned forward, his expression sharpening with professional interest. "That's approximately $3 million, correct?" $2.8 million, to be exact. "And if they can't raise the funds? Then they'll have to live with the knowledge that their precious family properties belong to the man they spent yesterday calling a leech." Gerald made several notes, his legal mind already working through the implications and necessary documentation. "There's one more thing we need to discuss. The will reading. I'd almost forgotten. In all the drama of family accusations and personal revelations, I'd lost track of the formal legal proceeding that would officially distribute Harold's remaining assets. When is it scheduled?" "This afternoon at 2 o'clock. Theron requested that it be expedited, probably hoping to establish legal ownership before you can make any claims." "What will they discover?" Gerald smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "They'll discover that Harold's estate consists primarily of personal effects, a small savings account, and detailed documentation of every property sale he made to you. They'll also discover a letter explaining his decision to sell those properties, and his gratitude for your discretion in allowing him to maintain his dignity during the transaction. So the will reading will essentially confirm everything I've been telling them. With the added authority of legal documentation and Harold's own written testimony, it should put to rest any questions about undue influence or financial manipulation." I felt a surge of gratitude toward Harold, even in death, looking out for the man who'd tried to care for him. He planned this carefully, didn't he? Harold was a meticulous man. He understood that family dynamics could become complicated after his death, and he wanted to leave a clear record of his intentions and decisions. I spent the next hour reviewing the documents Gerald had prepared, understanding not just the legal implications but the emotional impact they would have on a family that had built their identity around inherited wealth and social status. By noon, I was ready to face the Draven clan with the full force of documented truth behind me. But first, I needed to stop at home and attempt one more conversation with Corinna. She'd been quiet that morning, moving through our house like a ghost of herself, processing revelations that had fundamentally altered her understanding of our marriage and her family relationships. I found her in our study, surrounded by photo albums and financial documents, trying to piece together 8 years of hidden reality from scattered clues she'd missed or dismissed. She looked up when I entered, her eyes red from crying but her expression determined. "I've been going through everything," she said, gesturing at the papers spread across the desk, looking for signs, trying to understand how I could have been so blind. "You weren't blind. I was careful to hide it." "Too careful. That's what bothers me." She picked up our mortgage documents, studying them with new understanding. "You paid cash for this house, didn't you? There never was a mortgage." I nodded, recognizing that every financial lie I'd told was now being systematically uncovered and examined. The cars, the vacations, my graduate school tuition, even the engagement ring. She held up her left hand, where the modest diamond I'd chosen to match our supposed budget caught the afternoon light. "All paid for with money you inherited, not money you earned. I wanted you to choose me for who I was, not what I had. But what you had is part of who you are, Kaelen. Your options, your security, your ability to be generous without sacrifice, those things shape your character and your choices." She was right, and I knew it. My wealth hadn't just been hidden money, It had been hidden power, hidden options, hidden freedom that I'd exercised without her knowledge or consent. "What do you want me to do about it now?" Corinna stood and walked to the window, her posture mirroring my own from earlier that morning. "I want you to stop making decisions for me about what I can handle, what I deserve to know, what's best for our relationship. And the money? The money is yours. You inherited it. You've managed it. You've used it to help people who didn't even appreciate what you were doing." She turned back to face me. "But the marriage is ours. And I want to know if there's anything left to save after 8 years of fundamental dishonesty." The question hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure either of us was ready to cross. But before I could formulate an answer, my phone buzzed with a text message from Theron. "Will reading moved up to 1 p.m., family meeting immediately afterward. Your presence is requested." I showed Corinna the message. "They're accelerating their timeline because they're worried about what you might reveal." "They should be." She studied my face, searching for something I wasn't sure I knew how to give her. "What are you going to do?" I looked at my wife, this woman I'd loved enough to lie to for 8 years, who was now asking me to choose between revenge and redemption, between settling old scores and building new trust. "I'm going to tell them the truth," I said, "all of it, and then I'm going to offer them something they don't deserve, which is a second chance. The opportunity to prove that family means more to them than money." Corinna nodded slowly, and for the first time since Harold's burial I saw something in her eyes that might have been hope. "And what about us?" I reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. "I'm hoping that when the dust settles, when all the secrets are finally in the open, we might be able to figure out if there's still something real underneath all the deception." "I'd like that," she said quietly. As I prepared to leave for the confrontation that would reshape the Draven family's understanding of their own history, I realized that the most important relationship I was fighting for wasn't with them at all. It was with the woman standing beside me, wondering if 8 years of love could survive the weight of 8 years of lies. The truth was about to change everything. The question was whether it would destroy us or finally set us free. The Draven family home felt different when I walked through the front door at exactly 1:30 p.m. The same brick exterior and ivy-covered walls, the same expensive furnishings and crystal chandeliers, but the atmosphere had shifted from yesterday's hostile confidence to something that felt more like barely controlled panic. They were all assembled in the main living room, the same space where they'd humiliated me 24 hours earlier. Edmund stood near the fireplace, his usual commanding presence undermined by the nervous energy that had him checking his watch every few seconds. Octavia occupied her preferred position near the bay windows, but her silver hair seemed less perfectly arranged than usual. Theron had spread legal documents across the coffee table, like battle plans, while his wife Liana hovered nearby with her phone, probably documenting everything for her social media audience. Corinna sat alone on the leather sofa where we'd shared countless family gatherings over the years, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. She'd arrived separately, wanting time to process everything before witnessing whatever was about to unfold. "Kaelen," Edmund said, his voice lacking its usual boom. "Thank you for coming. I think we all regret how heated things became yesterday." The attempted diplomacy was almost laughable considering the venom they directed at me less than a day ago. But I recognized the strategy. Minimize yesterday's confrontation, reframe it as a simple misunderstanding, and proceed as if they held the moral high ground. "Do you?" I asked, remaining standing near the entrance. "Regret it?" Theron looked up from his documents. "We're a family in grief, Kaelen. People say things in emotional moments that don't reflect their true feelings. So calling me a parasite and accusing me of elder abuse, those were just emotional outbursts?" The room fell silent except for the familiar ticking of the grandfather clock. They'd clearly hoped I would accept their non-apology and allow them to move forward with their original plan to minimize my connection to Harold's estate. "The will reading is in 20 minutes, Vivienne said, dabbing at her eyes with that same lace handkerchief. "Perhaps we should focus on honoring Harold's final wishes instead of relitigating yesterday's misunderstandings." I smiled, recognizing the setup. They wanted to use the will reading to establish their narrative before I could present any contradicting evidence. The timing wasn't coincidental. "Actually, I think yesterday's conversation is very relevant to today's proceedings," I said, reaching into my jacket pocket. especially since you were all so concerned about protecting Harold's property holdings from outside influence. I pulled out the manila folder Gerald had prepared, thick with legal documents and property deeds. The sight of official paperwork made Theron's eyes narrow with professional interest. "What's that?" he asked. "Evidence," I replied, setting the folder on the coffee table beside his own documents. "Evidence that every accusation you made yesterday was not just wrong but ironically hypocritical." Edmund stepped closer, his businessman's instincts sensing danger. "What kind of evidence?" I opened the folder and pulled out the first property deed, Harold's childhood home on Elmwood Drive. "This kind." Theron picked up the document, his lawyer's training taking over as he scanned the legal language. His face went white as he processed what he was reading. "This shows you as the owner," he said slowly. "Correct. I've owned Harold's childhood home for 3 years." I pulled out the next deed. "I also own the duplex on Maple Street." Another document. "The commercial building downtown." Another. "The lakeside cabin." Another. "The rental properties on Oak Avenue." With each deed I placed on the table, the family's confidence cracked a little more. Octavia had moved closer to examine the documents, her pale eyes growing wider with each revelation. "This is impossible," she whispered. "These properties have been in our family for generations. They were in your family. Harold sold them to me to pay for his medical treatments when his savings ran out." Edmund grabbed one of the deeds, studying Harold's signature with the desperate intensity of a man watching his world collapse. "This has to be fraud. Dad would never have sold family property without telling us." "Your father sold family property to keep from burdening his family with the knowledge of how expensive his care had become," I corrected. "He maintained his dignity by handling his financial crisis privately." Vivienne sank into a chair, her handkerchief forgotten. "How much?" $2.8 million over 3 years. Every experimental treatment, every private nurse, every piece of specialized equipment that kept your father comfortable during his final illness." The number hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. I watched their faces as they processed not just the financial implications, but the moral ones. While they'd been living their comfortable lives, assuming Harold's wealth would eventually flow to them, I'd been quietly bankrolling his survival. "That's not possible," Liana said, her phone forgotten for the first time since I'd arrived. "Insurance would have covered his treatments." "Insurance covered about 30%. I covered the rest." Theron was frantically shuffling through the deeds, his legal mind trying to find some technicality that would invalidate the transactions. "There has to be something wrong with these documents. Some procedural error." Every sale was conducted with independent appraisals, proper legal documentation, and fair market valuations. I said, "Your father insisted on doing everything by the book." "But why?" Corinna spoke for the first time since I'd arrived. "Why didn't he tell us he was struggling financially?" I looked at my wife, seeing in her face the same confusion and hurt that had been tearing at our marriage since yesterday. "Because he knew exactly how you'd react. He knew you'd see his illness as a financial burden rather than a family responsibility." "That's not fair," Edmund protested. "We would have helped." "Would you? Yesterday you accused me of being a financial predator for getting too involved in his care." "What would you have called family members who actually had to sacrifice their own comfort to keep him alive?" The silence that followed was damning. They all knew the answer, even if they weren't willing to say it out loud. "So what happens now?" Octavia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I gathered the deeds back into the folder, taking my time to let the suspense build. "Now you have a choice. I'm willing to sell these properties back to the family for exactly what I paid Harold. $2.8 million. No interest, no appreciation, no profit. You can have your family heritage back for the cost of your father's medical care." The offer was more generous than they deserved, and everyone in the room knew it. After years of treating me like an outsider, after yesterday's public humiliation, I was giving them a chance to reclaim what they'd lost through their own ignorance and neglect. "And if we can't raise that kind of money?" Theron asked. "Then you'll have to live with the knowledge that the properties you were so desperate to protect from my influence have belonged to me all along." Edmund's face had turned red with what I assumed was anger, but when he spoke, his voice was hollow. "Harold knew we couldn't afford to buy them back. That's why he structured it this way. Your father structured it this way because he wanted to teach you something about family obligation and financial responsibility. Whether you learn that lesson is up to you." The grandfather clock chimed, marking the top of the hour. In the distance, I could hear cars pulling into the driveway as other family members arrived for the will reading. "The choice is yours," I said, heading toward the door. "But either way, this is the last time any of you will call me a parasite." As I reached the entrance, Corinna's voice stopped me. "Kaelen." I turned back to see her standing among her family members, surrounded by the wreckage of their assumptions and accusations. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for taking care of him when we couldn't." It wasn't forgiveness for 8 years of deception, but it was acknowledgement of 8 years of sacrifice. For now, that was enough. 3 weeks later, I stood in the kitchen of our home on Maple Court, watching the morning sun filter through windows that no longer felt like barriers between my true self and the world I'd been pretending to inhabit. The transformation hadn't been sudden or dramatic, but rather a gradual shedding of masks I'd worn for so long, I'd almost forgotten what my real face looked like. The will reading had proceeded exactly as Gerald predicted. Harold's remaining estate consisted of personal effects, a modest savings account, and a detailed letter explaining every financial decision he'd made during his final years. The family had sat in stunned silence as the lawyer read Harold's words describing my generosity, my discretion, and my refusal to accept gratitude for what he called basic human decency in the face of impossible circumstances. But it was what happened after the will reading that truly changed everything. Edmund had approached me in the parking lot outside the lawyer's office, his usual commanding presence replaced by something I'd never seen from him before. Genuine humility. "We need to talk," he'd said, his voice lacking any of its typical authority. "All of us. As a family." The conversation that followed in a quiet corner of Morrison's cafe had been unlike anything I'd experienced in 8 years of marriage to Corinna. No accusations, no defensiveness, no attempts to maintain social hierarchies that had suddenly revealed themselves as meaningless. Just honest acknowledgement of how completely they'd misjudged not just my character, but their own. "We can't afford to buy the properties back," Theron had admitted, his lawyer's precision applied to dismantling his own family's financial illusions. "Between our mortgages, business loans, and the lifestyle we've been maintaining, we don't have access to that kind of liquid capital." More importantly, Octavia had added, her silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the cafe windows, "we don't deserve to buy them back. Not after how we treated you." The apology, when it finally came, was comprehensive and devastating. They'd spent 3 weeks researching Harold's medical expenses, calling insurance companies, reviewing bills they'd never bothered to examine. The evidence of my financial support was overwhelming and undeniable, but more than that, it had forced them to confront their own assumptions about worth and family loyalty. "We turned you into a villain to avoid facing our own guilt about not being there for him," Vivian had said, her lace handkerchief finally serving its intended purpose. "It was easier to blame you for being too involved than to admit we weren't involved enough." But the real transformation hadn't happened in family meetings or legal offices. It had happened in the quiet moments at home, where Corinna and I began the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust from a foundation of complete honesty. The process had been more painful than I'd anticipated. Every shared memory required re-examination through the lens of hidden wealth and managed expectations. Every decision we'd made together had to be reconsidered in light of information only I had possessed. Our entire relationship history became a case study in well-intentioned deception and its unintended consequences. "I keep wondering who I would have been if I'd known the truth from the beginning," Corinna had said one evening as we walked through Riverside Park, a conversation that had been repeated in various forms for weeks. "Would I have been more confident, more ambitious? Would I have made different career choices knowing I had financial security?" I was trying to protect the authenticity of what we built together. I'd replied, the same justification I'd used for years that now sounded hollow even to me. "But authenticity can't be built on deception, Kaelen, even good-intentioned deception." She was right, and acknowledging that truth had been both liberating and terrifying. It meant admitting that my carefully constructed narrative of protection and preservation had actually been a form of control, however benevolent my intentions. The marriage counseling sessions we'd begun the week after the will reading had been brutal and necessary. Dr. Sarah Chen had helped us navigate the complex emotions around trust, honesty, and power dynamics in relationships. Where one partner controlled information, the other needed to make informed decisions about their own life. The question isn't whether Kaelen's deception was justified, Dr. Chen had explained during one particularly difficult session. The question is whether you can both commit to complete transparency going forward, and whether you can forgive each other for the different ways you've protected yourselves from vulnerability. That forgiveness hadn't come easily or quickly. There had been nights when Corinna slept in the guest room, days when we'd spoken in careful, polite sentences that felt like negotiations between strangers. But gradually, painfully, honestly, we'd begun to rediscover each other. The breakthrough had come when Corinna finally asked the question that had been lurking beneath every conversation. If you could do it all over again, would you still hide your inheritance from me? I'd considered the question seriously, weighing 8 years of experience against the theoretical purity of complete honesty from day one. No, I'd finally said. I'd tell you after our first anniversary. After we'd established that what we had was real, but before the deception could become the foundation of everything else. Why the first anniversary? Because by then, I'd know you loved me for who I was becoming, not just who I appeared to be. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was an honest one, and honesty, we were learning, was more valuable than perfection. As for the Draven family properties, I'd made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. Rather than keeping them as rentals or selling them to strangers, I'd transferred ownership to a family trust managed by an independent firm. The rental income would be distributed equally among Harold's descendants, but the properties themselves would remain intact as Harold had intended. It's what he would have wanted, I'd explained to Edmund when presenting the paperwork. He sold them to me to solve a temporary crisis, not to permanently remove them from family ownership. The gesture had completed a transformation in family dynamics that the will reading had begun. I was no longer the outsider seeking acceptance, but the benefactor whose generosity had preserved their heritage when they'd been unable to do so themselves. But the most important transformation had been internal. Standing in my kitchen 3 weeks after the confrontation that had changed everything, I realized I was no longer the man who'd walked into Harold's burial hoping to finally belong. I was someone who no longer needed their approval to know my own worth. My phone buzzed with a text from Gerald. Trust documents filed, properties officially transferred. You've given them back their history while keeping your dignity. Well done. Corinna entered the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, wearing the simple silk blouse I'd bought her for her birthday 3 years ago, back when she'd thought it was an extravagant purchase from a community college instructor's salary. Now she knew it had cost less than I'd spent on lunch that day. Any regrets? She asked, the question that had become our morning ritual. I considered it seriously, as I did every day. Regrets about the deception, about the lost years of complete honesty, about the pain we'd both endured learning to trust each other again, but also gratitude for the strength we'd discovered, for the foundation we were building on truth instead of comfortable lies. Just one, I said, pulling her into my arms. I regret that it took your father's death to teach me that love isn't protecting someone from the truth, it's trusting them enough to share it. She smiled, the first completely unguarded expression I'd seen from her since this all began. Harold would be proud of who you've become. Who we've become, I corrected. Sometimes the people who matter most will try to convince you that your value depends on their approval. They'll make you believe that belonging requires shrinking yourself to fit their expectations. But here's what I learned from being called a parasite at my father-in-law's burial. Your worth isn't determined by people who can't see it. The greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to stop performing for an audience that will never appreciate the show. When you finally step into the light as your authentic self, you might lose people who never really knew you anyway. But you'll gain something infinitely more valuable, the unshakable knowledge of who you are when nobody's watching. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your integrity? Tell me about it in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop pretending to be smaller than you are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.